Welcome to Tech Talks with Applied Catalyst podcast, where our mission is to promote catalysis and its commercial applications using non-formal discussion with friends and colleagues to practice in the field. I'm your host, Ben Egelske. I'm the senior engineer at Applied Catalyst, supporting catalyst development and catalyst manufacturing. And today I'm excited to introduce two things. The first of which is the show. This is episode 1. And throughout this series, we hope to engage the industrial community and highlight challenges in catalysis and chemical process, tech around those solutions, and a roadmap for implementation. And we want to achieve this by talking to people who practice the field. We want to leverage that experience. So if there's professionals who enjoy our content, we want you on the show. And we'll put some contact information in the description. And that brings us to our second point, which is our guest. So I'm excited to introduce Dr. Rahul Nabar. Dr. Rahul is an adjunct associate professor at IIT in Bombay. He received his PhD in 2009 from Dr. James Domesic at UW-Madison. Dr. Nabar's university responsibilities include catalysis, process intensification, and chemical policy making. These responsibilities complement his consulting business, Nabar Consulting, which supports tech due diligence for numerous clients in India, Europe, and the US, including acting as an expert witness for accident investigation. I'm happy to welcome to the show my friend and colleague, Dr. Rahul Nabar.
Thanks, Ben. Happy to be on the show.
Yeah, so I really wanted to do the show as our episode 1 because we just finished a 3-week business trip in India. And we're chit-chatting a little bit during that, and you made an interesting statement. You said, India's seen something like 10% growth, and that's been sustained for the last 30 years in the chemical industry. So I was wondering if you can kind of frame up a little bit of that history and then a little bit of the geography of how the India chemical industry works, and we can kind of go from there.
Sure. Thanks, Ben. So, India has always had a chemical industry for a very long time. A part of it was before India got liberalized. So that's 1991. Before that, we were a very protected market, and a lot of the multinationals were not around or had restrictions. And that was one reason for the Indian chemicals industry to develop. Post liberalization, the industry took off. It took a while for it to get going. But over the last 5 or 6 years, I think has been the high point in the Indian chemical industry. And I don't know the exact statistics, but if you look at individual companies, I'm seeing a lot of companies go at 15 or 20%, and some of them are not very small. And the growth has been due to a variety of reasons. But right now is a very exciting time in the Indian chemical industry. And although in the short run there are there's a recession and there are some other factors playing out. But everyone I talk to seems to be optimistic in the longer run. So in spite of having some short-term hiccups, there's a lot of projects on the ground, a lot of investments. And so I think it's a very good time to be in the Indian chemicals industry.
Yeah, just walking around, Bombay, Mumbai, there's always activity. You see guys building things almost constantly. And I know when we visited some of the sites in Gujarat and associated provinces, it was the same thing. Every single organization was full to capacity.
And part of that is, you see Ben also in the trade shows. So if, anyone has been a regular visitor to any of the trade shows in India, the dynamism and the size of the number of exhibitors is exploding. And if you're going to international trade shows, places like ChemSpec or ACHEMA, the number of participants from India, the number of industrial participants seems to be growing a lot. And so that sort of mirrors what you're seeing on the ground, that there is this spike in terms of projects and participation from India.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something we noticed at ChemSpec last year in Basel, right? It was, probably 50% European companies and then 25% Indian companies and another 25% Chinese companies. It's a good mix. So the Chem Expo show in Mumbai, that was the reason we were over there. that was interesting in and of itself. It was probably the biggest trade show I've ever been to. It was three full halls, and those three halls were packed to the brim of people.
A lot of what is happening is there used to be a lot of Indian manufacturers, say in the equipment fabrication side, and these were guys who, because of historical constraints, had figured out how to be very cost effective in manufacturing, right? And that was one of the Indian chemical industry's advantages. If you buy a reactor or other equipment, there were always options available here which were much cheaper than sometimes what you had in the international market. But a lot of these guys were not ready. The readiness in terms of export capabilities wasn't there, and this was variety of factors. Sometimes quality related, sometimes regulatory documentation. But what I see is over the last couple of years, many of these guys are maturing. They're making the incremental investments required in order to cater to the global markets. And I personally feel that's one reason why a lot of these guys are coming now to the shows, and hence you see a lot more variety or a lot more companies which are ready to sell things like equipment or catalysts on the international markets.
Yeah, so any growth in a new area, particularly our business, we're constantly helping startups and new technology come to market. So I empathize with, an entire country that's really coming online, and you're learning, a lot of things for the first time, and to be able to start in one spot and then transition to a place where you really are now world class. It's fun to see. I
Yeah.
congratulate people who are successful, because commercialization is not easy.
No. And a lot of it was also about investments, right? For a company to go beyond a certain size, there was capital required. The Indian banking system has been quite robust, but sometimes in terms of risk-taking abilities, there were certain constraints to going fast. What has happened over the last 10 years is also there's a lot of alternative sources for funding. There have been private equity, which has started seeing Indian companies of a certain size. And a lot of these funding channels have enabled companies to grow at rates which are phenomenal. So there have been companies growing at 30% rates and things like that. And I'm talking in terms of revenues or in terms of tonnage of production. Those sort of success stories more and more are coming up. And part of it is the accessibility to capital, which was not so easy in the past, but it's happening right now.
Sure. Yeah, so our kind of two businesses are associated in the sense that we get to see the industry across multiple channels, right? So we don't just work in petrochem, or we don't just work in specialty. You kind of get to see it all. So you work with a lot of startups, you do consulting work, you work with big companies. What's some like number one advice you give to a new guy that says, "Hey, I'm going to make the next latest and greatest catalyst chemical process"? What's your tip?
Yeah, so a lot of my work lies at the intersection of fields. For example, a lot of my work it lies at the intersection of the Indian markets or Indian manufacturing on one side, and foreign entities on the others. And these are foreign entities which may be trying for joint ventures in India, trying to source equipment out of India, entering the Indian markets for the first time, or on the other direction, Indian entities trying to enter the foreign markets or things like that, right? The other intersection I operate on is often the intersection of the technical, right? Having done a PhD and a postdoc, a lot of the projects do end up being technical, but my niche is on the intersection of the technical and the regulatory, right? So a lot of chemical regulations relating to plant or products, but also a lot of the intersection of the business side and the technical. And what I mean is advising people whether to invest in a certain project or which site, what kind of product portfolio to choose, right? So those end up being my kinds of projects. In terms of advice, especially about India, I always advise people to dip their feet in the water first. So what I mean is, it's always if you start out incrementally, right? So maybe you are ready for a joint venture or your own entity in India in say 3 years time. It's always easier if you start making the visits, participate in trade shows, or maybe have a source, start with a relationship as a vendor and a supplier, and then later graduate once you have a comfort level, right? Because it may not be the market for everyone, but how do you find out whether it's the right match for whatever you're doing? And so I always advise, start small, don't wait for things to be perfect, experience the markets. And in most cases, people do have a positive experience, right? So it's about there are cultural issues, there are it's a different country, and yeah, start slow and then build up your confidence, and in most cases that works out.
Very true, right? The best experience is experience. You know,
Hmm.
you gotta get in there.
Right.
And your comment about, it being a different country, it's interesting. You know, one thing I noticed in sales in general, right? It's all about relationship building, but
Hmm.
in India, that's numero uno, right? It's sitting down, having tea, talking to people, and just trying to understand the problems and just build trust. Uh, it's ingrained in the culture.
I think you make an important point. That's trust, right? At the end of it, no matter a lot of projects, I write a report. There's a lot of pages, there's discussions, but what I see more and more, it's finally the trust. Maybe two CEOs together or two owners together, right? It's finally about the relationship. No matter what, if you like working with the other guy, that accounts a lot for whether a relationship will go forward and or not. And that's not to say that, of course, everything else counts, but at the end, the last 10% is finally the trust which is built. And a lot has been written about, say, working with the Asian cultures or China and Russia. And I think each of these markets have their quirks about how they will go about with business. Some in some cases, things are very direct, and which may offend people who are not used to it. In other cases, you spend a lot of time on beating about around the bush, having other conversations before you finally come down to the negotiation. So these are all very cultural issues. But I think the more the more you do one, then the next one's unique, but you're not surprised by it. The more international deals you get involved in.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Hmm. Yeah, I was trying to think. I had a follow up question to that. I already missed it. So what are you spending most of your time on now?
There's a lot of travel and meetings. I think it's about a lot of time is spent in meeting people, because when you're identifying a vendor or an opportunity, oftentimes it's nine meetings that you do which don't work out, but the 10th one does. So a lot of it is about traveling, seeing new plants, meeting new vendors. Reading about new technology. So, at least in what I do, a lot of it is you come across a totally new project. So, for example, I hadn't done many semiconductor projects, but right now that's a big development in India. And then suddenly you are forced to enter a field. And of course, you're not an expert. So, although I might have a PhD, my PhD is on Fisher Tropsch. So, you enter a new area, and then of course you count on all the experience you've had in assessing things. A lot of it is heuristics, a gut feel for whether this is right or this is going to work out or not going to work out. So it's also about understanding new areas. Green hydrogen is one, semiconductors has been another. 5 6 years ago, a lot of it was specialty chemicals, which still is, but once you the early projects where you're doing in a new area, I think that's very accelerating because you're just trying to understand a new domain, and things are very complex these days. So there is the specialization everywhere. The challenge is to be a generalist and get that knowledge from the specialist and comment enough on it so that it's accessible to a generalist audience. So that's a lot of what I end up doing.
Sure. So that's a wide breadth of information, right?
Mhm.
All those different fields. Where do you go for what's your go-to for finding new information, right?
Hmm.
You go
Oh.
books guide, you go to library, you Google, and for you, you're traveling all the time.
Mhm.
So to keep up on that, bouncing
Yeah,
between
I mean, a lot
airports.
of resources. Of course, Google's always around at finding resources. On the more technical projects, it end up being stuff like patents, a lot of journal articles. But I view journal articles a little differently than I used to as an academic, right? So you don't normally have the luxury of understanding and becoming an expert at this all these minor details. But it's about trying to skim through an article and understanding whether that's going to be a fit for the project, or reading a lot of articles and getting a feel for the field. So that's what I end up doing. A lot of the handbooks I find are extremely valuable. I mean, starting from the age old Perry's, but I think there's a lot of distilled information in handbooks, and I'm very, things like the Handbook of Industrial Mixing. I think there is you save on a bit of time rather going to the fundamental literature and the sort of things I do, because what happens in the basic literature is over time, some results stand, some results don't. But when you have an expert from the area who writes an article in the Kirk Othmer or Ullman or places like that, right? So they've distilled that intelligence and identified, what's commercially possible and things like that. So I tend to be doing a lot of handbook reading. I also love trade publications. And coming from an academic background, I think we did not read trade publications enough. So I mean stuff like the Chemical Weekly, hydrocarbon processing,
Hmm.
not academic peer-reviewed literature, but trade literature. And every field has evolved its trade magazines and things like that. And I find those immensely valuable because it's not science, it's not fundamental science or peer-reviewed research, but a lot of the advances, right? So where's a new pump coming to market, or who's building a plant where, and what technology are they using? A lot of inputs like that. I love reading the trade magazines.
Yeah, it's true. I know personally, whenever I start a project, I instantly go to almonds. And if there's a
Hmm.
section on it, your heart rate goes down because it's quality information
Yeah.
and it's concise,
Oh, I agree with
right?
you. Ullman's, Kirk Othmer, Perry, these are still go-to resources. And sometimes I feel like a dinosaur. Perry has been around forever, but it's still the go-to resource. It saved me, enormous amount of work otherwise.
So that's an interesting statement, and in catalysis, like our art is pretty ancient, right? Most of it was invented in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. And where do you kind of see the field going from here, right? Because it's the old stuff works, but there's only so many group 8 elements on the periodic table. How do you get that next catalyst for that next application?
Yeah, you're right. And I wouldn't call myself, I mean, these days I don't invent, I've never invented new catalysts. But what I see is, although there are so many elements, like you say, right, when you add in support or, catalysis has always been an art relative to the rest of the chemistry. I mean, we are a bit like alchemists, right? You do the same catalyst 10 times, and unless you have your muffle furnace firing processes or other things exactly right, you may not get the same particle distribution or whatever that is, right? So I think, although there is a limited number of elements to play around, we've been shown by all the geniuses which came before us that when you do the right things or add a promoter or a co-promoter, right? So a lot of degrees of freedom there, especially in catalyst processing. And to some extent, I think we still don't understand, uh, you know, exactly how do you process a catalyst in order to give the right result. And that's one result why we still have catalysts coming out. Or even if you go to one of the big vendors and look at just their palladium catalysts, there's so much of variety out there, right? So I don't think that's going to stagnate. We're going to come up with new catalysts. The new What I'm very curious to see is the new advances, stuff like AI, the way it has been panning out on the protein design side, in biomolecules, whether we'll get a lot of that in the catalysis side. So, it would be the dream of people to have a particular reaction and have an AI system come up with an exact catalyst. And there's been a lot of rational catalyst design going on. My PhD work was a bit in that area. But I think, deep down, a lot of the advances are still just a lot of heuristic and experienced people out there coming up, and serendipity. I mean, we can't deny that catalyst design has been a lot of hard work and serendipity, and then you get the right catalyst. So yeah, I think catalysis is going to stay. The way there is a pressure from sustainability, yields, and all that, I see a lot of fine chemicals become catalytic or migrating from, say, homogeneous to heterogeneous or batch to continuous. So I think it's going to be crucial. A lot of that is also about identifying the right catalyst. So what I see in my neck of the woods is there may be a catalyst already out there, but the discovery problem isn't trivial, right? If you're a chemicals manufacturer, you're not really a catalyst expert, and you may not even figure out that a certain catalyst which was tested at another place at another time was the perfect fit for your need. So one is coming up with better catalyst, but one is just inventorizing all the knowledge which is out there and recommending the top 5 or 10 catalysts that people need to try. I mean, I don't think that has become very easy yet. The large companies probably have great teams internally or work very closely with catalyst vendors. But if you're looking at the smaller guys, right, they don't have an ability to choose a catalyst very rapidly. And I think that's a role that a lot of small guys like Applied Catalyst on the catalysis side are going to play for the industry.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of even major organizations, they've largely outsourced their R&D,
Hmm.
right? So it's kind of this first to follow model now. And what ends up happening is you get, a little tiny company that does the R&D, gets it to a position, then somebody buys them. But there's this intermediate between, lab demonstration and commercial viability that's like that pilot bench scale. That's kind of tough to fill. And you're right. There's companies, like us that kind of fill that gap.
So that's the hand holding part. And having had this discussion at some of the larger catalyst vendors, right? So this is the problem. Suppose you are $1 billion refinery and you're hunting for the next catalyst. You pretty much have a direct line of connect into all the catalyst vendors. But now
Yeah.
imagine you are some smaller pharma company sitting in India, China, or just anywhere in the world, right? And you have a catalysis problem. Just go to one of the websites of any of the vendors and try to put in something, and then the number of hoops you have to jump through, to contact someone, and maybe you get a reply back, maybe you don't. And I don't blame the sellers, right? Because they have a limited bandwidth, they have a fixed number of people, so they have to focus on certain projects that bring in the revenues. But the question is, how do you help all the other guys? And I think that's where there's a role for a lot of smaller players, niche technology. How do we? I don't think personally we are in the general industry using a lot of the recent advances in LLMs or AI in order to have even recommendation systems, right? Suppose I say a system, this is my chemistry, and what might be promising catalysts from the 20 vendors out there. I don't think there's a good way to do it. So that sort of handholding is, I think, a gap which is very valuable. And I totally see you and your team at Applied Cat or similar companies playing that role.
Yeah. 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 The intermediate scale, if you've
Hmm.
done any time in scale up work, it's nonlinear.
Right,
That's where
right.
most technology fails. And that's why, consultants and people who have done it, learning from the experts, the show, right? That's what we want to bring to those guys that are trying to kind of take off is some of that knowledge.
I just say that there is, there was a lecture. There's plenty of room at the bottom. There's a plenty of room with the small guys. I don't think they are getting serviced very well in the larger catalyst supply chains. And so what I mean is even small, say 50, $100 million companies, when they struggle, right, with a process, with a batch to continuous conversion, I think these are guys that don't really have huge R&D departments internally. And so rather
Right.
than them develop those capabilities internally, I think there's a role for specialists which are happy with smaller projects. And so that's the niche I see.
In terms of advancements in the chemical industry, there's a ton of processes that have been implemented in the fastest way possible, right? Get
Mm-hmm.
to market as quick as you can, we'll optimize later.
Mm-hmm.
And they've been running that way for 20, 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
So I think personally, there's tons of low hanging fruit there in terms of, like you said, let's say that $5 to $20 million company range. They have reactors, they're doing chemistry, they're producing a molecule. Is it optimum? Probably not.
There you
And
go.
they don't have the resources to do it, right? They're interested, but they just don't have the resources.
So I think scale is one dimension, right? You said, right? If you're small, it's hard to access that. The other dimension I see happening a lot these days is geography. So if you look at all the great advances, platforming, Fisher tropes, right? The locations where these catalysts were developed, and historically where there are large teams and equipment to develop these catalysts, has been in the West. What has happened over the last 10, 20 years, a lot of manufacturing has shifted to nations like China, India, which do have catalyst development abilities in the universities, for example. But they do not have these, they don't have large catalyst development commercial teams. And bridging these geographies is again a challenge, right? So a lot of the problems lie in a location which may be in the east, whereas a lot of the resources or technology or past know-how from the last 7 decades lies at a different location. So you may have an expert sitting in Chicago, but the problem lies in Hyderabad in India. How do you bring these things together? I think is a logistics challenge, and if you do that better, we'll solve more problems for both ends. Because the guy selling the catalyst needs to sell it, right? So he needs to find the problem, and the guy with the problem needs to find the right expert to solve it, right? So how do you bring that together is some place where we can do better.
Well, I tell you, you hire Nabar Consulting.
Or applied catalyst.
I mean, really though, that's your space. You do a lot of work in Southeast Asia and Europe, right? Those are your two primary regions.
That's right.
So if there's anybody that can talk about connecting, the Western and the Eastern world, that that's what you do.
No.
right?
And so when you asked what is it that I do a lot, it's about understanding a problem and then accessing your knowledge of past projects and connections, right? The key part is connections. You can't develop internal resources to solve all problems, but it's about knowing who may have a ready catalyst or who may have a team or equipment for a problem that a particular site has, and you got to do it fast. One thing is time scales, that's the other problem, right? If you go through the conventional development, it's been too slow, whereas the industry now, right, if you have an impurity, I've had past projects where there's an impurity in a product, right, and they have modified their distillation or change a packing, and they're working on the order of days or weeks. Like if they don't do that, they're going to lose a major order from a multinational, right? And so how do you make these things happen fast? That's another challenge.
Yeah, in the development space, you maybe have 3 months,
Mm-hmm.
and then someone's getting pulled aside, and management's having a conversation about whether or not we're going to kill it. Um, the speed is key. First to
Speed is
market.
key,
I
yeah.
understand why first to market is important.
And this was a transition that I also went through. Like if you look at academic grants, right? Say you're writing something to the DOE or NSF. I mean, the grant review process can take 3 or 6 months, right? Or if you're working in larger projects, right? If you come from a petrochemicals background, just the approvals for a project to take a year, and then you work into some of the other sectors, specialities, etc. Smaller sectors, smaller projects, but the timelines are much faster.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even getting like under contract, you may have
Mm-hmm.
gotten the grant, but just getting the paperwork signed can take six
Yeah.
months. Totally different worlds.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of fun watching, my colleagues, right? I'm out of graduate school about 3 years ago, so everybody's kind of easing into the industry. But seeing
Mm-hmm.
people make that transition, you can't study something for 6 months to a year to, figure out what the active site is. It's just got to work, right?
Right.
So pulling on resources and leveraging expertise other than what you have internally,
Mm-hmm.
that's the fun part. Putting the pieces together to execute this big, massive goal, right?
But there's also a gap between academic and the industrial use cases. And a famous example from even the catalysis area is all most of the papers you see on the academic side. They invent a great catalyst, do selectivity conversions, but you don't really do long-term trials. And what the industry really, in order to adapt to catalyst, you want to know, is it going to deactivate? How does selectivity change over time, right? And that's a translational ecosystem where even in India, I think we are hungry for players. Like who does that? Because most universities are not very well placed to do like a 6 month trial to evaluate a catalyst, right? On the other hand, the moment you want to sell that or license that off to the industry, that's the question you get. So you need a player, which is probably going to be a private player, an independent player, who does the job of translating a great breakthrough into a usable technology package where you have, you've tied up all the things and you have all that data.
Yes, testing catalyst lifetime is always a pivotal point. It's a
Right.
really good spot where you got to make that decision, but it's
And
also
how
the most
many,
challenging
how
because the
many,
best way to do it is to run. You
correct.
got to run the chemistry. You just got to run it 6 months,
And how
right?
many academic publications have like a 90-day or long-term data on catalyst? Very few. There are some, but it's not easy to do that, right? You have a grad student, he wants his PhD. You want to publish, you don't want to keep your results confidential. All kinds of things come into the play there. So yeah, long-term catalyst trials, getting good data out there.
You got to have the budget.
You
You
got to
got
have
to
the
keep a
budget for it.
reactor running
Yeah.
for 6 months. It's not zero.
And I've seen
It's a
cases
lot of
on
effort there.
the industrial side where that's where the skepticism comes in. So a lot of smaller industries have been burned because they saw a paper mention a great catalyst for a process and they bought it and they adopted it and then discovered that it deactivates, right? And so once that happens to you the very first time, you become intensely cautious. And then getting over that skepticism is the hard part. Then. For a lot of new
Yeah, if the
technologies.
x-axis, sorry, if the x-axis is minutes, you
Mhm.
should be skeptical.
You should be skeptical, and so a lot of cases like membranes, for example, people sometimes it's like the $100 note lying on the floor, right? People are not, unwilling to adopt a new technology because there's intense skepticism. Like, okay, this membrane works great in this trial, but how is it going to perform 3 months, 6 months? Who's going to give me a guarantee? Can I replace it? Is it going to foul? All of those things come up.
Yeah, because a chemical plant, feedstocks change, conditions change. The operator comes in after a long weekend, and it's going to see some disruptions that you're
Yeah,
not
and
necessarily simulating in the lab.
I mean, there's roles for membranes in areas which are non-glamorous. Like in India, a big hot topic is pollution prevention, and so a lot of specialty plants generate high amounts of TDS, total dissolved solids. And right
Hmm?
now, most Indian plants are not getting permissions unless they are zero liquid discharge (ZLD). So they have to recycle all the liquids, which means they have to boil off all the solids in multi-effect evaporators or things like that. Now, those operations they reduce pollution, but they are intensely energy hungry. So your greenhouse footprint is not great because you're using a lot of steam to boil these things up. I think that's another area where membranes could. I mean, there is reverse osmosis and things like that, but most of the membranes can't really deal with fouling by solvents or chemical content, right? So if you have some COD in addition to the TDS, the membrane normally doesn't work so well. So I think that's a great area to develop robust membranes, where if you do
Hmm.
that, and I mean, this is pollution control and the effluent treatment. It's not been a glamorous area, but a lot of challenges lie there. I mean, increasingly, the cost of treating your effluent is a major cost of the product. For especially for the smaller value specialities, you're spending a lot on treating your water.
Yeah, I think about that statement. You say it's not necessarily glamorous, but look at the payoff.
Yeah,
How many chemical plants need to discharge?
right, right.
All of them.
All of them. But look at an incoming PhD student, right? We have been there. How many incoming PhD students are going to come in and say, "I'm going to work on developing a membrane to handle the waste of an industry," right? Everybody wants to have the next best cancer drug or a hydrogen. Like people love to work on the cool areas, but there are these blind spots where I think there's a lot of low hanging fruit out there.
I mean, the payoff is huge. If you like, so as a young person, right? If you're trying to convince somebody that that's a good way to spend the next 10 years, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
realistically, that's how long it would take them to an industrial area,
Mm-hmm.
right? And just show them, like, here's the people that live in the area. Look how much you can improve, you know, livelihood by just fixing this problem, and then
Yeah,
multiply by a million, because that's how many plants there are.
and
And I
since
think people would hook on to that.
I work on the teaching side as well. I think there is a lot of value to what you're saying. A lot of people go through a bachelor's or a PhD having visited a few plants, maybe, or no plants. But if you could
Or
just
none.
get none,
Yeah,
yeah,
none.
and that's incredible. If you could get people to just visit plants, whether they make a breakthrough or not, it would just improve the perception of what's relevant, what's not relevant. You just get a better feel of things.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge.
Hmm.
We had a period of time where a lot of people flooded into computer science. Like that
Hmm.
was the hot topic. It kind of goes in waves. I think my group, we had quite a few chemies, but the group after us, yeah, there was this move towards computer science, and I'm not quite sure where people are headed now. Where young people are going into. I don't have my finger on it, but you do. You work in that space. Where do you see interest nowadays when people enter college?
I think, I mean, the current flavor is definitely things like AI and LLMs, and and that's not bad. I mean, those advances are great. I think it's about what's the optimum allocation, right? So, of course, AI is going to be there, but we're still going to need to wear clothes and use pesticides and do whatever else it is we do. So, we do need more talent here, and so I think it's been AI. Before that was there's some other areas. There's always been a flavor for every 5 years. Things change. But I think as chemical engineers we've become used to it. But for a long period of time, it's not have it's the number of high school kids who are going to come up and say I want to work in specialty chemicals or catalysis is, I mean, I'm sure there are, but it's a smaller fraction. And yeah,
Yeah,
but
good luck explaining to a high schooler you need to wait about 2 years to have something happen.
and I think
That's the sales cycle. It's about 2 years.
absolutely, but some of the faults is us. I think chemicals is very opaque, right? When things happen in AI, you see them. Yeah, you get a chat GPT on your phone. But when we develop a new catalyst, right, I mean, it's in a refinery behind doors, opaque. You need a lot of permissions just to take a walk. And so I think we are also pretty, I wouldn't use the word paranoid, but I think the industry should work together on improving perception, because at the end we do need a lot of smart guys, and unless we expose them to the excitement of chemicals, and I'm not saying what happens in the lab, that's great, but when you see a large tall distillation column or a big FCC reactor, I mean, there's a sense of awe in it, and that has to go. I don't think it's getting transmitted to the students.
Yeah, and it's critical too. I mean, it's something like there's 2 points. one is that catalysis is like the original green chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
By nature, you make
Mm-hmm.
everything super efficient. Without it, you couldn't do most chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
And then two, that chemistry is used in everything,
Mm-hmm.
every product out there, right? So it's really the baseline enabler for most of what modern life is. So
I agree.
figuring out a way to communicate that, uh, the industry could work on it.
Yeah, and even in India, I think in India we could do a lot better at that, and we have a lot to learn from places like AICHE or ACS in popularizing science. I think the focus has been doing great new science, but we've not communicated it to the general public, and so then the perception, what does a person read about in the newspapers? Pollution, accidents, toxicity. I mean, sure, those are problems you have to tackle, but people don't really appreciate the amount of good the chemical industry is doing.
And those little, like, the accidents, they're rare.
Mm-hmm.
They're extremely rare. Being in the industry, we've done a fantastic job, developing policies and procedures and really technology and design strategies to mitigate all that risk.
Yeah, I
It's
think they're rare. Yeah.
amazing.
Also, I think there is something to be said about the bad apples. I mean, accidents don't always. There is an element of just bad luck to it. But also sometimes in a place like India, the bad apples can color the industry. So in terms of enforcement and things like that, right? The good guys have to showcase what they do, so that the industry doesn't get colored by some guy flouting the rules or a place which is just unlucky, right? I don't think people are great evaluators of risk, right? So it's just like a plane crash. An airplane may be a very safe way to travel, but one crash, just remember, people remember that one crash which happened. And it's similar for chemical accidents. You never remember the years and decades of stuff that went perfectly fine, but that one accident is so ghastly that people remember that for a long time.
And the complexity of some of these operations. If you work in the industry, you understand that statement.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing how many things have to come together the right way every day
Mm-hmm.
to provide the products that everybody knows and loves. From
Agreed.
logistics to operating the facility to supply chain to just the chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing.